Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. This is the Facts and Fallacies podcast. My name is Cameron English. Excited to be your host as always. Our good colleague Liza is still traveling the world. She's coming back from the Middle East as we speak. So I am joined by John Antine, founder, executive director of Genetic Literacy Project, soon to be renamed is the rumor on the street. John, maybe you can tell us about that. But in any case, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Cam. I love your show. It's also a GLP creation, but nonetheless, your name has soared far beyond the GLP at this point, and I love the subjects that you independently take up with Liza every week. An avid listener and raring to go.
Ah, shucks. I'm a blushin'. Well, thank you for the kind words, John. I appreciate it. So we're going to go back to a topic we've hit a lot over the years. Liza and I talk about this pretty frequently. We talk about it on our spaces on X every Friday at 11 a.m. Central Time, which you should all attend. Of course, I'm talking about this concept of predators, these ambulance-chasing lawyers that in so many ways have rigged the public discourse about all sorts of science and health topics, everything from pesticides to baby powder of all things. But any sort of chemical that you can construe as harmful, basically, they've turned into an industry where they can bilk unearned wealth, just rivers of money out of companies that haven't done anything wrong. And they do a very good job of telling this sort of Aaron Brockovich redux, as I call it, right? Big bad company, unsuspecting customer, harmful product. Wash, rinse, repeat over and over for decades at this point. And I know you've been writing a lot about this. You just did a webinar with an organization called the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, or FAIR. They've been doing really good work on this. So maybe we can start there, just set this up for us. I think when people read about a lawsuit in the news about a pesticide, for example, right, their perception is this is just an organic situation that's evolved. And as you well know, oftentimes the lawyers are, they are, of course, behind the lawsuits, but they're arranging the academic work that's being done to scandalize the chemical. And in many cases now, they're actually paying for the news coverage they're getting. So maybe just lay the groundwork for people if they're not familiar with this.
Sure, Cameron, thanks. I want to put this in a slightly broader context because the predator industry and what's going on there, and I'll give people some understanding of what it is really a tactic. And the bigger issue is really how environmental groups have changed the way they influence the public discourse on issues. And in my mind, they're really undermining the very things that they claim to support. They become anti-technology, anti-innovation, and we see this on a range of issues, not just chemicals. We see it on things like nuclear energy. We see it on fracking, climate change issues, carbon capture and storage, frankly, AI. And what you see is the sort of radical fringes, and sometimes not so fringe, on the left, and now joined, interestingly enough, by the far Trumpian right. They kind of met on the crazy end of things, opposing innovation on the idea that either it's being generated by big government, which is a no-no on the left and the right, or is that it's too risky, that the risks far outweigh the benefits. Like on AI, for instance, we all know how revolutionary it is. I use it every day in my work, where a year ago I didn't, and it's used to solve many problems, health issues, all kinds of things. But the big worry on the left is that it solidifies its corporate power among a certain number of corporations, that it's potentially rogue, that it puts people out of business, and all those things are true. I mean, you can go back to the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and change begets change. I mean, there are consequences to it. The whole Luddite movement of the early 1800s was a group of rural English farmers who opposed the Industrial Revolution because they saw their life shattering. What they saw shattering, some of it was abject poverty in rural England, but some of it was family values, and suddenly they saw their kids going off to work 18-hour days in factories in Britain. So you understand the impetus by people when they're fearful of technology. But that's not quite what this situation is. This isn't just judicious fear of technology. This is outright distorting of the facts on the ground, and the belief that technological innovation is driven by and for corporate world. I wouldn't even say corporate America. And that's just not true. And frankly, because of the suspicions about big government, we see, again, this is proliferating among the left and the right. So should we jump in and should I contextualize the predatory situation, or does that give you a kind of a context? Or maybe you have some thoughts on the broader way of situating what this debate is about.
No, I think that's a good setup, and we can get into the specifics in a second. But what I find fascinating about this, and we touched on this on our space, Liza and I have talked about it as well, is this like weird coalition that's coming together, and as someone who leans to the right on a lot of issues, I find this particularly fascinating. Is you have these people who will say, as you mentioned, I don't trust the federal government, I'm an individual, the market can solve a lot of our problems, just leave us to interact and serve each other's needs and so forth. We have the price system, we have the price signal and all this stuff, right? We don't need government. But then when it comes to these health and science issues, all of a sudden you get a far left Democrat in RFK, and this guy is, he's a prophet, or like they don't use that language, but that's in essence what they're saying is we're going to put this guy in charge, and we're going to allow him to crush all of these companies that we don't like, or these industries we don't like, because there's this corporate conspiracy going on. And I just find that whole dynamic fascinating, that they can suspend these ideals that they seem to hold very passionately in this one case, right? It doesn't apply in this case. And I find that just incredible, right? Because the trial lawyers are not conservative in any meaningful sense. My understanding is they donate heavily to the Democratic Party. But they seem to be going along with this, and they think the outcome is going to be favorable. So maybe you can talk about that, and then we can get into, some of the specifics of the litigation.
Sure, and also people should also understand the United States is very unique in how we handle tort cases involving controversial products, whether it's tobacco or whether it's aspartame or talc or glyphosate or BPA, a range of things. In any other country, they're more science-based when they deal with tort laws, and they also put limits on things. It is not, you will not find a corporate a jury endorsed by a judge putting out $2 million judgments against McDonald's because their coffee was too hot. You just don't find that in other countries. It's a very, very unique American experience where so-called damage awards, assuming they're even warranted, are so out of proportion to the actual damage that it was caused, because we have a system where we literally want to punish corporations for behavior that a unschooled, unscienced jury believes is outside of their moral framework. And that's what we have in cases when you're going after a lot of products, and we've talked to a few of them, and we'll talk about more, that are really safe and have a benefit to society. But like any product, there's always pluses and minuses. No product in the world, whether it's AI, or whether it's artificial sweetener, whether it's 5G technology, they all have potentially negative consequences if they're misused. Again, other countries, Australia, Canada, and Europe all restrict the kind of grotesque rulings that are really hobbling industry and hobbling innovation. And it's bizarre because, again, this has become a province of the left. That they're the generators of this. And almost all the things that they're attacking are things that are really benefit the very people that they claim to support. And it's really almost a fascist kind of response, I think, to innovation. And again, because of the reaction to big government and concerns on the far right, it's now become talking points on the right. And RFK Jr., who you mentioned, I mean, he's a he's a monster from the Blue Lagoon, but he's a left-wing monster from the Blue Lagoon, right? He's a creation of the left, no question about it. And no one would have questioned that 5 years ago when he was, he cut his eye teeth suing on the issue that antidepressants were killers and should be banned. And his main his main legal ally in this was a law firm named Weisner Baum, which is the Church of Scientology's law firm. He's been a partner of the Church of Scientology for over 25 years, and the Church of Scientology's policy is to get antidepressants banned. And so he was a creature of the left, widely celebrated on the left because he was anti-corporate. And now that he's going after some sacred cows on the left, some on the left are breaking from him because of the COVID vaccine and his denunciations of that. But this is an ideological swamp we're in right now, where both the left and the right are swimming with lagoon swamp creatures like RFK Jr.
Yeah, the only explanation that really makes sense to me is that they see this as justified retribution for what went on during COVID. So their perception is, well, these pharma companies were in bed with the government forcing this vaccine on people. So if they go bankrupt, to hell with them. Who cares? Let freedom ring. And I don't think they understand the long-term implications of this, and I don't think they realize that the people that they're playing footsie with are not going to stop at the agrochemical industry. They're not going to stop at the consumer products industry, right? They're going to go after, and they already are, oil and gas. And as you said, AI, any kind of technology that they find offensive on an ideological justification is going to be in the crosshairs. And so that's what's alarming to me. And I guess maybe one question we can explore is, are people going to have to feel some pain before they go, okay, we made a wrong turn somewhere. We need to scale this RFK guy back. I don't want that to happen. And Dr. Kevin Fulton and I talked about this on the last episode of the show. We don't want to see kids not get vaccines. We don't want to see people go hungry or have to pay more for basic necessities. But at this point, I'm sort of at a place where I'm like, okay, well, maybe it's going to take you going, oh, right, cause and effect, right? I need to learn from experience. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the proverbial doo-doo is about to hit the wall, frankly, hit the fan. And we see it on the issue of crop chemicals, where Trump was overwhelmingly supported by farmers around the United States because they've had it with big government in their perceptions of it, and they align with, I think, classic conservative values on a lot of things, and felt that their voices were not being heard. Now we have RFK Jr., who is really going to go after conventional agriculture. He's going to go after the judicious use of crop chemicals. He's going to go after genetic modification, which has, the United States uses on a per acre basis based on toxicity, 1/2 the amount of toxic chemicals that France and Belgium uses. It's remarkable. We are one of the toxic-free areas of the world, relatively speaking, to almost any European country, which makes noise about how awful American agriculture is. And yet RFK Jr. is gunning for the very products and the very structure that conservative Republican farm country America supports. So really, we're going to see a huge hue and cry, I think, over the next 6 months, and a recalibrating of this. And I think hopefully push back on the Trump administration to rein in RFK Jr. I mean, maybe we can only limit his destruction to healthcare, and he won't ruin farming as well. We will see. But yeah, so we also should really give people the idea of how the predatory system works. So from your perspective, Cam, because you see this on the outside, I mean, you're now deeply into this. You know the whole predatory issue, and I'll again outline it in a little bit more. But when you were first writing about agriculture, and did you see the role of this alliance between environmental groups and tort lawyers, and I'm about to explain, Wall Street investors and philanthropists? Was that something that was on your radar? And I think you're really one of the most sophisticated journalists in this area in the world. So I'm curious, because I wasn't on my radar 5 years ago.
No, I think initially when I started to look into it, and once we started to collaborate on some of this, it's amazing how deep the rot goes. You just don't know. I mean, from the outside, you look at the NGOs like Natural Resources Defense Council or Environmental Working Group. I mean, they're the public face of it. So it's easy to see them and see the fallacies in their arguments. But there's so much that goes on behind closed doors that you don't see unless you look really carefully, right? So and this is something I think is of special interest to you, is that there's this very intimate collaboration with the media in many cases. So you have these NGOs planting stories, in major news outlets. I don't. It's not like someone's random blog. It's like the Guardian, which is infamous for its left leaning politics, but it's still a massive name in journalism. So people will read the Guardian and
Gets it right on science. Even they have a fair number of their science writing staff that are actually crack and really good. But they have a couple of prostitutes as well, and I don't think they're prostitutes for money. They're prostitutes for fun and just for the fun of destruction. That's what makes it a little bit more heinous.
yeah, it's frustrating to be sure. And what I find particularly troubling when it comes to the press on this is that they're selective skeptics. So when it comes to something that RFK says about vaccines, right away it's like, well, let's go talk to Peter Hotez or let's go talk to Paul Offit and let's fact check what he's saying. And they're not going to fall for any of it, right? And they're onto his litigation scheme, and we're not buying it, right? But when it comes to crop chemicals, for example, all of a sudden, right, we're just gonna take what this guy says at face value. I mean, he's a trial lawyer. What would he be, dishonest about? I find that fascinating. That was the angle that is most important to me, I think, because this is how you convince people, right? The people that end up on juries read this stuff, So, and that's an important aspect of it, is that this is how they sort of pollute the jury pool, is they get these stories out about this.
Permeates things. It's not
right.
just an article. It's part of the ecosphere. You can't even
right.
get away from it.
Yeah, the school groundskeeper, the single mom. I think they failed by trying to bring the kids into it because it's a really hard sell that kids are getting NHL from glyphosate, so they weren't able to push it that far. But it's the Aaron Brockovich story, right? It's innocent victim, evil corporation. We all know how those bastard companies operate, and that's all it takes, So I think that's been one of the biggest things we've had to focus on, is that you have people like Carrie Gillam and others, who tell this story, right? These silly anecdotes about these corporate documents just showed up on my front porch at night. I don't know who left them there. I think I know who left them there, Carrie, if you really want to know. And this becomes the narrative. And one of the first stories we wrote years ago was about the so-called Monsanto papers, this story that, we got all these documents. You won't believe what's in these. So I said, all right, challenge accepted. Let's go read these. And it's nothing. It's, the nothing burger is kind of a cliche at this point. When you read through these documents that are supposed to be scandalous, it's like company scientists talking about, like, well, should we use this word or that word, or here's a study we did. It's just, you know what I mean? But because no one's going to read through 8,000 pages of PDFs, this narrative sells. So I think that's the biggest thing that was a revelation to me, and that still really needs to be untangled publicly so people understand what's going on.
Absolutely. Let me sketch out a little bit about this complex. I call it a web of disinformation, so you understand it. And the spider in the web is really the environmental movement, and they're not the environmental movement of our fathers and ancestors. I'm like ancient. And I grew up before the EPA even existed. And environmental movement, they were always going after excesses by corporations. And that's right, because corporations sometimes put the bottom line ahead of public interest. But they also saw themselves as carriers of a responsibility for the general public good. And that's really what it was for a long time. So you have huge organizations like Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Foundation that today carry on that mission. These are $1 billion a year nonprofits. You don't hear a word about what they're doing in the world today. Who do you hear about? You hear about Environmental Working Group with a $100 million budget, or Natural Resources Defense Fund with a $150 million budget, or Pesticide Action Network with an $80 million budget, or all the swarm of nobodies on social media, like Moms Against America, in my mind, who are making noise. You don't hear because the big companies are not into this web of disinformation. And what this web of disinformation is, environmental companies, environmental groups recognized that their issues were not getting traction, and they depend on donations from people. So whether it's creating a lot of attention and scare about BPA, which we're all fearful is in our plastics, and you now can't pick up a bottle that doesn't say BPA free on it. There were tons of lawsuits, and the Clinton administration was, the Obama administration was so intimidated. They set aside $40 million for 27 separate studies. Meanwhile, all the companies phased it out because of all the lawsuits. Well, what happened? Every single study came back that BPA is not safe. It's now, you can't pick up a bottle without it saying BPA free. What has replaced BPA? BPS. BPS is carcinogenic, while BPA is not carcinogenic. The environmental groups which are saving us from cancer are not saying a boo about the fact that the products that the chemical replacement that they urge for is worse by far than the one that was fairly benign in the beginning. So you have environmental groups, but they raised billions of dollars on the BPA thing. Other issues over the years that they've focused on have been glyphosate is probably the biggest moneymaker. Fear of chemicals killing bees, neonicotinoids, which is a class of chemicals that are used in agriculture. And I will get a little later in the show, you should remind me about it, but I'll give you an incredible anecdote about the whole collapse of the bee collapse claims. We were facing a bee Armageddon and an insect Armageddon, and now if you read the newspapers like the Washington Post and a few others, oops, we were sorry. Bee population is at the highest in history. Oops, maybe we should have talked to an entomologist instead of the Natural Resources Defense Council as our source. And we'll talk about that because that's an example of how science gets caught up in this net. So the spider, the poisonous spider, is the environmental groups. They didn't have money for years, and they what's called tobacconize their policy. They recognize that the only way they can succeed is to sue. That was the opponents to the tobacco industry. I'm anti-tobacco, so I think it was a great strategy there. But that's now been unleashed as a tactic, and environmental groups recognize that they can create a public attention on an issue, convince the media, which is very naive about chemicals and understanding risks and hazards. So any chemical potentially is scary if it's portrayed right by the media. They got funding from lawyers who started out focusing on things like antidepressants, like the Bon Headland Church of Scientology lawyers and RFK, and now they're wholly into chemicals. And they work with, believe it or not now, there are Wall Street hedge funds, a number of companies that rake in billions of dollars a year, and it goes directly to the environmental groups and to tort lawyers to fund suits that they will not necessarily win on because they don't expect them to go to court. They will win on pre-sort settlements because companies don't want to do what Bayer did, which was risk. Sure, they settled on a lot of them, but they also didn't settle on some. The ones they didn't settle on, they got roasted by juries. So we have this machine now, which is made up of this group of lawyers, ambulance chasing lawyers, and environmental groups, and Wall Street. And another angle to this is that we now have a group of far left philanthropists. And I say this, you and I are politically similar in that we're skeptics, which I think is what unites us. But I kind of lean a little bit more to the left, though I'm constantly embarrassed by it. But then when I see, Trump meeting with Zelensky, I suddenly say, yeah, no, I'm not a Republican. Sorry about injecting that into the middle of this. But, we have a situation that is that is really dangerous. It's volatile, and it's all happening either below the level of the press reporting on it, or the press is quietly cheering it on and reports about this as if, of course, what the Environmental Defense Fund is Environmental Working Group is saying is true. Of course, of what NRDC is true. So they'll have a quote by the NRDC saying, this chemical will kill you, aspartame, an artificial sweetener that the FDA says you have to drink 36 cans of Coke every single day for 30 years before you have an increase of 1% in your chances of cancer. And yet they're winning lawsuits on this. And so they interview the NRDC or the EWG, and then they say, an industry spokesman says, as if, who are you going to believe? An environmental group that you think is iconic, or some spokesman for Bayer? And it's I don't know how we get out from this other than exposing what's going on, which is why we're talking about it now.
Yeah, it's going to take, and as much good as we try to do, you need the people who are the target of this to, pull out their guns and fight back is really what it takes. And, maybe that's another aspect we can discuss briefly, is that a lot of industries, and I get this mindset to a certain extent. They just want to go about their business, right? You know, if you're a pharma company, you want to make drugs that treat conditions and that are profitable, right? You don't want to have this whole PR machine that fights back against all of these people. And as you said, the environmental groups have this halo for a lot of people in the public, right? I mean, they're called environmental working group. That sounds very scientific, and it's about the environment. How bad could that be, right? And so it's hard for people to realize, you know, the David and Goliath narrative is phony. It's been fabricated,
Well,
right?
actually, in some ways,
Yes.
the real
Yeah.
money is with the environmental groups and Wall Street, not with corporations who, I mean, they're spending money on research and development. They can't afford to spend it on the PR stuff, and so they lose every battle when it comes to money versus money.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. That, you know, industry in order to exist has to provide useful products. But, you know, the NGOs, all they have to do is manipulate language. That's what they exist for.
That is their product. Their product is creating, hysteria, so they can get their political and ideological agenda. And unfortunately, they become so detached from not only science itself, but the public interest. Many of the things they support end up hurting the very people that they claim to stand for, which is disgraceful, which has turned me against many in the mainstream environmental community. Thank God we have the Nature Conservancies and the World Wildlife Fund and a group that others consider controversial, but I really like Environmental Defense Fund, even though they sometimes clash with some of my views, but they're very transparent and they do want to work with industry in a constructive way. The others are friggin' nihilists. That's what they are.
Yeah. I think maybe our mutual colleague, David Zarek, has come up with the best possible solution, which is what you need industry as a complete entity, different companies, different industries. You need them all to wake up and go, we could crush this if we would work together on this collective effort to put these lawyers in check, to put these NGOs in check. But Zarek's observation over the years has been they just don't want to be the slowest zebra, right? As long as there's another company that's being devoured and I can go on doing my business for a few more months or a few more years, that's fine, right? We'll settle, we'll make peace. We'll donate money to a children's hospital so people know that we're really nice and loving and
until they become the slowest zebra.
Right. So ultimately, and as we talked about this on a space as well recently, it's going to take big institutions with lots of money and lots of influence. Not corporations are part of that for sure, but you need people with political influence, with political power, who will oppose this, because otherwise you just have these insanely wealthy institutions with very good lawyers and very good public relations people running the show. And until, go ahead. No, it's okay.
My big disappointment is this should be an issue of the political left. Instead, the only ones who seem to be supporting corporations are the traditional conservatives, some of which are actually on the edge now because they don't know whether to swallow the RFK bullshit whole or not. But frankly, to me, if there was a genuine left that cared about preserving innovation, technological innovation, reasonable risk taking in the world, because innovation does not happen without risk. This should be a left wing movement, and they're like nowhere to be seen. They're AWOL here, and that's disgraceful. That belies their claims that they're for the people and for all the people. They're not. They're for special interest groups.
So maybe I'm a little too Pollyanna-ish on this point, and maybe I'm just being hopeful, but what I would like to see and what I think is possible is that there are other influences within the Trump administration that could at least slow down what Kennedy wants to do. Because for everything Trump says and all of his nationalist rhetoric, I mean, he's a billionaire and he's got a lot of a lot of support from corporate America. Mm-hmm. So I would not be surprised if at some point some CEO pulled him aside and said, "Hey, man, you got to pump the brakes on this guy because he's doing a lot of damage." I could see that happening. Maybe I'm being too hopeful. But when I watched Kennedy's confirmation hearing, there were clear points where he was moderating his rhetoric, or, like on the issue of abortion, which is a whole nother can of worms. You would have a senator say, 2 years ago, you were, the biggest leftist on this issue. And now all of a sudden you don't did you change your opinion? What happened? And of course, we all know what happened is he's in a Republican administration that has to cater to right-wing Christians. And so he has to temper what he probably really thinks about that issue. I'm wondering if the same thing could happen on agriculture or certain medical and healthcare topics. What he really thinks is that these vaccines are, they've got worms in them or whatever, or they're going to, make your kid grow a third arm. But he's not going to be able to say that stuff and get what he wants. So maybe there's a hope that he's going to be moderated in some aspects. What do you think?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball on this, but I'll put it in a slightly different context. Trump has fired dozens of cabinet people in his other administration. He will cashier RFK Jr. if he feels that he's creating unnecessary conflict with his constituents, not purely because of political expediency. I mean, Trump does have some values, and some I agree with, particularly in accord with things like his views of agriculture up until recently, as RFK Jr. has taken a higher profile position. So I think that there's definitely going to be tension on these issues. We'll see if RFK Jr. can make it work, or I would predict, and again, well, I did predict the Philadelphia Eagles were going to win the Super Bowl, so I do have somewhat of a recently good track record. But beyond that, I don't know. My guess is he doesn't last more than a year, and that he will. There'll be recognition that the negatives at least are equal to the positives, and he doesn't need that because he can get an RFK Jr. type that isn't hostile to, let's say, conventional agriculture, or doesn't see every corporation as worthy of ridicule. And RFK Jr. in that is a traditional left-wing, anti-corporate Bernie Sanders liberal. That's what he is. In certain ways, in the way he talks about that. That will ultimately not sit well with Trump's base, and I don't think it'll sit well with Trump, especially as he gets feedback from, a lot of the bigwigs in the Republican Party.
We've been alluding to some of the consequences that could come from this, but maybe we can get into some examples. You mentioned neonicotinoids. That's so obscure, I don't think people understand how important that is. It's a great innovation in agricultural chemistry because it is so low toxicity, and it minimizes risks to off-target insects.
Why don't you give us a little background on what neonicotinoids do?
Yeah, well, I'll defer to you on that, but basically they're seed-coated insecticides, so you don't have to spray the plant anymore, and then as the plant grows, it takes up the insecticide, and if a munching or a sucking insect attacks the plant, it dies. So it's an enormous innovation. As I said, it's a sustainability benefit. But the way it's been approached by the environmental movement is, we've got colony collapse disorder, and it was definitely this insecticide. There, of course, was no evidence whatsoever that took place.
No link between the two at all.
No link between the two. And maybe you can get into the fact that these bees they're basically cows, right? They're an agricultural animal. It's not like we just go out in wild and just spray chemicals at them as if that benefits anybody. But I remember in Europe, and I think in the UK as well, maybe this was before Brexit, they started getting rid of access to neonicotinoids, and I think it was their sugar beet industry that was really hit hard by this. And at one point they had to issue what's called a derogation, which is just basically, okay, the ban isn't in effect yet, so you can use these for a little bit longer, because the industry was decimated that badly. And then, of course, Sri Lanka, maybe we can talk about that. But in other words, we have precedents for what happens when you ban chemistries that industries rely on, or really any input. So maybe talk about that, because I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I also want to be a realist and say, look, there are consequences on the horizons if we don't pump the brakes on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Neonicotinoids really debuted in the 1990s. And let's be clear, it's not like glyphosate is a single product. Neonicotinoids is a class of products. And because they're a class of products, each one of the neonicotinoids have different degrees of toxicity, side effects, all kinds of things. So the key thing here, and what the critics don't do, is they don't look about them individually. And they're, in a class of neonicotinoids, and there's about, 5 or 6 that are most heavily used. There are some that are potentially have more side effects or consequences that might be negative than others do. So keep that in mind. This is not whenever we use the term neonics, recognize that the critics of it are trying to demonize them as a whole, when that's not what science is about. But the reason, as you said, the reason they became so popular is they cut down dramatically, some cases more than 50%, the amount of pesticide spraying we had to do, insecticide spraying that we had to do on farms. Farmers don't want to spray more than they have to, so these were very targeted. In other words, the only people that the only animals that were affected were the insects themselves, rather than spraying it on the environment. So obviously, a lot of uptake. As you said, there was no connection to neonicotinoids and the so-called colony collapse disorder, which is a historical phenomenon that's occurred once every 30 to 60 years, going back to the year 1000 or so, as far as documented history goes. And I've written numerous articles about this. And the person who coined the term colony collapse disorder was a scientist with the U.S. government, USDA, and now I think he's at Penn State, if I'm not mistaken. He was at Maryland, now he's at Penn State. He coined the term, and he made it clear that the reasons bees died from this are a different kind of death than they get from chemical poisoning. There's no relation. The way the queen died, the way the other bees in the hive responded to it. So there's no relationship. So that anybody who associates CCD with insecticide use or chemicals, miss the science memo. What they're getting is the journalistic propaganda and activist memo. And yet that is when people talk about CCD and the great fall off in bees 20 years ago, they all say chemicals, pesticides, farm industry. Still isn't a race. Doesn't matter. That's what people say. And I get into fights even with really well-schooled journalists about that. Hopefully nice fights. But still, it's hard to get that point across. So basically what you had is that the activist industry, and that's what I want to call it, who are anti-genetic modification, they're anti-conventional agriculture, saw an opening when bees started dying. And this happened bees started dying in CCD around 2007, 2008. There was still a lot of overwinter deaths, which is unpredictable. CCD began to slow down around 2008 or 9. It didn't happen in places, CCD didn't happen in places like Australia, didn't happen in Western Canada. It only happened in certain areas of the world, and they happened in areas where there was an infestation of what are called varroa mites. And varroa mites are these mites that latch on to the back of bees, and they ultimately suck their energy out and ultimately kill them. A lot of the deaths are now attributed, I say 70% or more of the deaths we know that happen independent of CCD are the result of infestations of varroa mites and other kinds of things. So as the situation got a little bit better, but still was in crisis range, and varroa mites were proliferating like crazy. And again, they don't exist pretty much in Australia. They don't exist in Western Canada. So they never had this fall off that the United States had. Well, the activist industry had made great hay about linking pesticides and in particular neonics to die-offs of bees. And they started fundraising campaigns basically saying, ban the bees. And how many pictures did you see on the internet or on your newspaper of a tiny little bee with its feet up in the air dead, and someone pouring neonics on its face, right? That's the images that we have. And it was on the front page of every single, and Sierra Club had it, save the bees. And what was in the picture? A big donate button in green, because that's how you save the bees. You donate to the Sierra Club. It was the single biggest money-raising campaign, and I would say scam in the last 25 years. Made so much money. And then you get Time magazine in 2013, a cover story saying "A World Without Bees" was the cover story. And what was fascinating about the article, I read it at the time. I had already written 2 articles, one for the GLP and one for Forbes magazine, which I was writing about at the time, about why we don't have a bee crisis. We have the end of CCD, which is actually getting better. And let's understand that was a phenomenon. And yes, bees are vulnerable for a whole set of reasons, varroa mite being one. And the other, I'll talk about in a bit. Anyway, I'd already written that. Then we have this cover story. Suddenly, the world exploded within like months. The banning happened in Europe. There were discussions in Congress about banning chemicals, specifically neonicotinoids. What was fascinating in reading the article is that there was not one interview with an entomologist. Imagine that. No entomologist. There were 4 interviews one with a farmer and three with activist groups. And only one of the three activist groups was actually a scientist. There was an English major and there was a history major. So that was the basis for this Time magazine article, and it literally became the Bible. So since 2013 on the GLP, we've had 64 articles about the bee crisis. Very nuanced articles. Some went 4,000, 5,000 words. Not denying there's a health crisis among bees. There really is, and to deny it would be ridiculous. But why is there a health crisis? One of the articles, I interviewed an entomologist, a well-known one called May Birnbaum. She was an advisor to the far right wing, to the right of Genghis Khan administration, the Obama administration, right? And she worked with them on their bee policy. And I asked her, what are the 10 most biggest threats to bee health? And she says, well, varroa mite is probably overwhelming. Then there's habitat loss because of urbanization that particularly shows up in Europe. Then there's climate change issues, and we have had a very variable period in climate change. I'm not saying there's climate warming, I'm just saying variability doesn't work well with bees. She went on and on with this list. And I said, wait a minute, what about neonics? You haven't mentioned neonics. Oh, she says, oh yeah, that's on the list, that's number 11. and like, this is a woman who's like a left-wing Democrat, Obama supporter, and like the entomologist community has been on to this since before 2013. The only people who were not onto it were environmental groups and the water carriers at places like Time magazine. And then in 2018, New York Times had a cover story about the insect apocalypse that never was then, never is thou. But again, no entomologist interviewed in that. It was all an activist scientist from Europe who has a history of getting paid, documented. I've written articles about it, from environmental groups whose fundraising depends on the kind of hysteria that this guy generates. I'm not saying he's not sincere in his beliefs. I think he was. He just happens to be flat out wrong. So what happened? By 2019, the Sierra Club kind of scratched its head and said, honeybee numbers are kind of coming back. They're kind of higher than they were at the worst part. I mean, at the best part after colony collapses. Or maybe honeybees aren't in danger. And they had a small print in their thing. Little by little over the past 5 years, that view has collapsed. The Washington Post did a 3-part series earlier this year in January, February, about the honeybee population being the healthiest it's ever been. And it's not really healthy, and I'll explain that in a second too, but the healthiest it's ever been in terms of numbers all throughout the world. Highest in the United States since the 1970s, which is when varroa mite came to the United States on the backs of some Japanese honeybees. And there is not one. And guess what happened in March? An editor from Vox magazine, who just happened to be the guy who wrote the article for Time magazine back in 2013, had a big headline article saying, mea culpa. I got it wrong. I was seduced by environmentalist propaganda. There has never been a bee crisis. I misreported it. I went to the wrong sources. He said something pretty stupid, which I'm not going to get into now because it'll take us off in a tangent. But basically, he admitted that he had fallen for activist propaganda, and yet if you go out and you ask the public right now, 80% of people still believe that neonicotinoids and other harm bees. So the media bought it, hook, line, and sinker. Some of them are in league with environmentalist groups. Others just, like the awful reporters at The Guardian, just believe that the environmental group is whiter than snow, when it's not. Everybody has an agenda. And if you're not a sophisticated enough journalist to sniff out when you're being played, whether it's by an ugly big corporation, which is greedy, and there are some, or the environmental groups, then you shouldn't be in the journalism business.
Yeah, it strikes me mostly as gullibility, because they sympathize with that kind of a narrative, and it's a fun story to tell, right? If all the players are set up for you, all you got to do is fill in the words, which Grok can do for you if you're lazy. Nevertheless, I think we've got a real problem on our hands, and I think what you illustrated just now is that they will cultivate a scandal and milk it until it's dry, and then they just move on, right? So they tried the wild bees gambit for a little bit, then they went on to all insects, and they started to move away from neonics, then it was glyphosate, and then it was, whatever, right? They always move on. There's always a new thing. So they cause chaos. They make a technology toxic, metaphorically speaking. So people are mortified by it. They send companies into bankruptcy, and then they just go do it somewhere else or in some other industry. And if this continues, I mean, we're in real trouble, right? I mentioned Sri Lanka; their economy collapsed because they bought into this fairy tale about organic farming, bringing the Garden of Eden back, and so that's a small country. What happened there is tragic, but if it happens on a bigger scale, if it happens in the EU, right? If and they've been sympathetic to a lot of this stuff, but if that gets traction
right now by some of the rhetoric from RFK Jr., sure.
Right. So it's really alarming. And I guess there's no simple answer as we wrap up here. I guess it's just going to take people becoming aware and, not lending their vote or their dollars or any kind of support to people who say crazy things. That's a longer term project, I think. I don't think it's going to be happening in the next 4 years, but, who knows?
Yeah. Big corporations can be hazardous to your health, but so can big environmental groups. Let's put it that way. The key is to be skeptical, but also be constructive about these things. We have to understand that innovation is a risky enterprise. Nothing is going to happen without recognizing that there's winners and losers in it. Our goal is to maximize the winners and provide balm to the losers. That's how innovation happens. Otherwise, we're going to kill modern agriculture. We're going to kill AI. We're going to kill nuclear energy, which is producing the no carbon energy. A whole raft of innovations that we can't run away from just because they present some degree of risk in the world.
Well said. Yeah, it's your standard of living that is on the line here. This is not some abstraction. Companies get money because they sell you things, and if they can't sell you things, then you don't have the things they sell. I'm trying to put it as simply as I can, but like your well-being is on the line here, everyone. So we'll wrap it up there. John, you are on X. Handle's just at John Entine, I believe. People can follow you there. You're pretty active. You get into some fiery but mostly peaceful interactions with. I'm
not sure about the mostly peaceful at times, but okay. And one other thing, you did mention that we are rebranding later this year.
Yeah.
The Genetic Literacy Project is what's called doing business as a DBA, as a nonprofit. Originally the Science Literacy Project, but never operated that way. But these issues now are becoming bigger than biotechnology and agriculture and medicine. They're really issues like that we've talked about, the range of things here, and it's really about a mindset of preserving innovation in an era where technological risk-taking needs to be preserved. So we're rebranding, and I hope people will follow us as we recreate a consensus community that fights for innovation.
Yes, go do it. Geneticliteracyproject.org for now, I think, is still the URL for people to visit. John, as I said, at John Entine, and then follow us. It's at Dr. Liza MD, and I'm at Cam J English. The three of us host The Space every Friday, 11 a.m. Central Time. We talk about all the issues we covered here, plus all kinds of other stuff, all about trying to reestablish public trust in science. So we hope you join us. Thank you for being here with us, and we will see you next time.